Media outlets in the West constantly fearmonger about China, and politicians in the United States frequently complain about China's growing global influence.
This is the single greatest challenge this nation has ever faced. We have never faced a near-peer adversary that poses such a comprehensive challenge with China as today. Soviet Union was a military and a geopolitical rival. They were never an industrial, a technical, or commercial rival. China is all of that and more.
But they don't explain why Beijing has become more influential internationally. They want the world to be afraid of China, but they don't give the rest of the world a good reason to actually be afraid of China. And we know what Washington is truly afraid of. Several US government officials have said the quiet part loud and complained that China is the only country powerful enough to challenge US global dominance.
Even as President Putin's war continues, we will remain focused on the most serious long-term challenge to the international order, and that's posed by the People's Republic of China. China is the only country with both the intent to reshape the international order and, increasingly, the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. The scale and the scope of the challenge posed by the People's Republic of China will test American diplomacy like nothing we've seen before.
But there are two main causes of China's growing global influence. They are political and economic. Political because China does not interfere in the internal affairs of foreign countries. China has a very hands-off and non-interventionist foreign policy. It has not been at war since 1979, whereas the United States has an extremely interventionist policy. It has carried out hundreds of military interventions in most of the countries around the world. It is constantly at war, and the US has organized coups and regime change operations to overthrow foreign governments. So China has won a lot of friends around the world because it tells them, we can work together and we're not going to try to destabilize you and overthrow your government. But that's only one reason. The other major reason for China's growing global influence is its economy. China overtook the United States to become the world's largest economy in 2016, according to data from the International Monetary Fund, when you measure its GDP at purchasing power parity. As of 2024, China represents 19% of the entire global economy, whereas the US only represents 15%, and over time, China's share of the world economy is increasing, whereas the US's share is shrinking. But it's not just the size of the overall economy, but also the fact that China has become the world's factory. China alone is responsible for 35% of the entire world's manufacturing production. That means that China produces 3 times more than the United States, and furthermore, China produces more manufactured goods than the next 9 largest manufacturers in the world combined. So as the US economy has financialized and deindustrialized in recent decades, the US produces less and less, whereas China produces more and more. China produces everything, all of the consumer products and technologies and phones and computers and cars and more that the world wants. This is why China has become the #1 trading partner of more than 120 countries. That is a majority of countries on Earth. And if you look at a world map showing which countries have China as their top trading partner, you can see that just 2 decades ago, in 2000, the US was still the largest trading partner of most countries. But as of 2020, the tables have turned, and China has now become the most important trading partner of most of the world. Politicians and media outlets in the United States tell people that they should reduce their ties with China, and instead they should grow closer to Washington. But what is the US actually offering? And increasingly we see that it's not really offering anything. A clear example of this is Latin America. This is a region of the world where the United States has invaded almost every single country, and the US has organized coups that have overthrown elected governments in many countries in the region. The US has imposed unilateral sanctions on numerous countries in Latin America. And given these extreme interventionist policies, it's no surprise that many countries in Latin America have looked across the ocean to China as a new potential partner, and Beijing has always emphasized that it has a non-interventionist foreign policy. It will work with anyone and trade with everyone. So as China has grown massively in the past few decades and established itself as the world's #1 economy, China's trade with Latin America has also exponentially increased. And if you look at trade between Latin America and China, and if you exclude Mexico, China is the largest trading partner of the region. Of course, Mexico and the US have a free trade agreement and they're neighbors, so they are each other's largest trading partner. And that does end up skewing the data a little bit, but many other countries in Latin America do more trade with China than they do with the US. And given China's growing partnership with countries in Latin America, US politicians have been trying to revive a 200-year-old colonial doctrine, the Monroe Doctrine, that declares that the region is Washington's so-called backyard. Now, this has been bipartisan. Both the Republicans and the Democrats have fear-mongered about China's influence in Latin America and also Russia's influence, and essentially told countries in the region they cannot have close relations with China and Russia. Although this kind of neo-colonialist mentality is bipartisan in the US, Donald Trump and the Republicans have really pushed this idea hard and have threatened Latin America and tried to pressure the region to cut ties with China. But again, we have to ask, what is the US going to offer the region? China is offering a lot of things. Not only is China offering a non-interventionist foreign policy and diplomacy based on equal relations, not only is China offering trade and the largest market in the world, but furthermore, China is investing literally trillions of dollars in infrastructure around the world through its Belt and Road Initiative. This is a massive global campaign in which China has, again, invested trillions of dollars building railroads and ports and schools and hospitals and other forms of infrastructure in dozens of countries. And this is largely being done by Chinese state-owned companies that are not operating for profit, unlike Western corporations that are only seeking profit. Instead, this infrastructure development is based on what China refers to as the idea of win-win cooperation and mutually beneficial development. China helps to build critical infrastructure in these countries so they can become new trading partners for China in the future, which also means that China is no longer so dependent on the US economy. China is no longer dependent on exporting its manufactured goods to the US market. And we've seen that Donald Trump started a trade war on China. The Obama administration declared a so-called pivot to Asia, in which they essentially announced that the US military was going to prepare for a war on China and was going to take troops out of the Middle East, out of West Asia, and send them to East Asia, to the Pacific, Asian Pacific region, to prepare for a conflict with China. So China could see that the US is trying to decouple economically, and so China started creating alternatives. And the Belt and Road Initiative just marked its 10th anniversary, and in the past decade, China has been investing in infrastructure around the world to diversify its trade routes and to become the most important trade partner of the regions of the world that have the fastest growing economies and the fastest growing populations. Asia is the region of the world with the fastest growing economies. Africa is the continent with the fastest growing population. And China has become a major trading partner of both of those regions. So what is the United States offering as an alternative? Well, pretty much nothing. Donald Trump offered sanctions and tariffs and a trade war and threats. And what has Biden offered? Well, basically the same thing as Trump. He's continued trade war and sanctions and tariffs. But the Biden White House announced in 2021 a program they called Build Back Better World. And the US government-funded propaganda outlet Voice of America openly admitted that the goal of the Biden administration was to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative by creating another option, which is led by the United States, and backed by the G7. This is the group of 7 colonial countries that colonized most of the world. That's North America, Europe, and Japan. And what are the plans for the so-called Build Back Better world? Well, the White House said that, quote, the G7 and other like-minded partners will coordinate in mobilizing private sector capital, end quote. The White House added that their goal is to, quote, support and catalyze a significant increase in private capital to address infrastructure needs, infrastructure investment by a responsible and market-driven private sector, end quote. So what the US really means is that the Western countries are going to rely on private corporations that are seeking profit and want to exploit poor countries in the global South and build infrastructure that is privatized and owned by these private Western companies so rich investors can get richer and richer off of poor people in the global South. In contrast, China's Belt and Road Initiative is completely different. This is being overseen by Chinese state-owned companies that are not simply seeking profits. In many cases, they're investing in these projects that are not profitable, but because they're done by state-owned companies, which barely even exist in the West, these state-owned companies can help to develop projects that they might lose money from or not make any money from, but it's part of an overall political project in which China and its partners are trying to deepen their cooperation and create alternatives to the West so they're no longer economically dependent on Western markets. And at the 2024 G7 summit, the Western powers let the cat out of the bag and revealed that BlackRock, the world's largest investment company, is overseeing their global infrastructure initiative, which was previously Build Back Better World. Basically, nothing happened over 3 years. There was very little infrastructure actually built. And in 2024 at the G7 summit in Italy, they announced the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment alongside BlackRock CEO and chairman Larry Fink, a billionaire oligarch who is very close to the US government. And they announced private capital for projects with the private sector. They noted that Global Infrastructure Partners, which is owned by BlackRock, plans to invest $4 billion toward infrastructure projects.
The IMF and the World Bank were created 80 years ago when banks, not markets, financed most things. Today, the financial world is flipped. The capital markets are the biggest source of private sector financing, and unlocking that money requires a different approach than the bank balance sheet model of yesterday. There's still a lot of work to be done, but reform over the past 8 months have resulted in billions of dollars of new dollars for the developing countries' infrastructure. That's what you saw last week with the announcement of the Investor Coalition. BlackRock, GIP, KKR, and other major firms will deploy $25 billion in Asia's emerging economies. This is why building new infrastructure is critical, especially through public-private partnerships.
So this is the West's alternative to China's state-led infrastructure development campaign. It's privatized infrastructure in which for-profit investment managers on Wall Street plan to suck out wealth from poor people in the global South and then make their rich investors even richer. In November 2024, we saw a clear example of the major differences between the US and China and their approach to the global South at the summit of APEC, that is the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Group. This is an economic forum consisting of countries in the Pacific region that are trying to deepen their trade. And the November summit was held in Peru in South America. And China's president traveled to Peru in order to attend the APEC summit. And while there, China officially inaugurated a huge megaport that it built in Peru, which is known as the Port of Chancay. This was constructed over 5 years, starting in 2019, and it cost more than $3 billion. 60% of it was funded by China's state-owned shipping company, COSCO, which again is not a private for-profit company, it's a state-owned company. And the other 40% of it was funded by a Peruvian mining company called Volcan. This megaport is a real game changer and will help to massively increase trade between Latin America and China. So not only Chinese exports to Latin America, but also exporters in Latin America are going to benefit from having access to the massive market in China and Asia. Again, Asia is home to the economies that are the fastest growing in the world, and Asia also has a majority of the world population with so much potential for deepening its trade with Latin America. And this is part of a larger series of infrastructure projects which are aimed at deepening trade and economic integration, including railways that would go across South America, connecting Peru to Brazil, which is the largest country in the region with the largest economy. So the opening of Chancay Port in Peru truly is a historic development. But like clockwork, as soon as this port was inaugurated, the US media published a series of reports fear-mongering about it, and Newsweek published an article titled "China Unveils Megaport in America's Backyard Amid US Concerns." So we see not only is it fear-mongering about China, but this is a neo-colonial narrative that goes back to the 200-year-old colonial Monroe Doctrine that claims that Latin America is the United States' so-called backyard. Now, this is ridiculous on so many levels. First of all, Latin America is an independent region with sovereign states that are not US colonies. They're not anyone's backyard. But it's also even more hilarious when you realize how far Peru is from the United States. So from the capital of the US, Washington, D.C., to the capital of Peru, Lima, it is 3,500 miles. That is 5,700 kilometers. This is extremely far away. And again, even regardless of the distance, it is not the US backyard. Latin America is an independent region. In response to the inauguration of this port, a former official in Donald Trump's first administration, who will likely come back in Trump's second administration, who was one of Donald Trump's top advisors on Latin America, he threatened 60% tariffs on all goods that go through the Chancay port in Peru. So the United States is threatening Peru, someone who's likely going to be in Trump's second administration overseeing Latin American policy, is threatening Peru because it collaborated with China to build this megaport. The US wasn't offering a port. If Washington doesn't like it, why didn't the US help Peru to build a port? Well, because it wouldn't be profitable. Because the US government only does things if US private corporations can make a lot of profits from them. So instead, Washington is threatening high tariffs to punish Peru and other countries in the region for daring to trade with China. The irony is that the US has a long history of violating the sovereignty of countries like Peru. In fact, as recently as 2022, the US backed a coup that overthrew Peru's democratically elected left-wing president, Pedro Castillo, and then the Peruvian military and police killed dozens of pro-democracy protesters with complete backing from the United States. And yet the US is fear-mongering about China's influence in Peru, despite the fact that Peru currently has a pro-US government that came to power after a US-backed coup. However, China is Peru's largest trading partner, and it's more important for Peru's economy than the US. And furthermore, the construction of this project at the port of Chancay goes back to 2019, and the project itself goes back to the 2000s. It really took well over a decade to develop this port. So it's not just one individual president in Peru. The reality is that for the Peruvian economy, even for Peruvian elites, their trade with China is more important than their trade with the United States. So what is Washington going to offer? It wants countries like Peru, even after overthrowing their governments, it wants them to cut ties with China. So what is the United States going to offer these countries tangibly if it truly wants them to reduce their ties with China? Because unless the US wants them to sacrifice their economies, to destroy their economies on behalf of Washington, it has to tangibly offer them something. Well, during the APEC summit in Peru in November, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken traveled all the way to South America in order to pose for a press conference in front of a bunch of old trains from the 1980s, and he proudly announced that the US had supposedly donated these 40-year-old trains to Lima. The Biden-Harris White House also repeated this claim that Caltrain from California was donating 90 passenger cars and 19 locomotives to the city of Lima, Peru. However, this is not true. This is a lie. They were not donating them. In fact, hilariously, when U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken posted video on Twitter showing these 40-year-old trains that the U.S. had supposedly donated to Peru, so many people called out this lie that they actually added a fact check, a Twitter note to his tweet that noted that Caltrain had recently upgraded to brand new electric trains, and they were selling their old diesel locomotives and rail cars for use in Peru for $6 million. It was not a donation. In fact, a newspaper in San Francisco, California reported on this in an article titled "Caltrain Finds International Buyer for Retired Diesel Fleet." This media outlet, SF Gate, noted that Caltrain was paid $6.32 million from the deal, which involved selling the 40-year-old trains from the 80s to Peru. They were sold. They were not a donation. So this is Washington's so-called alternative to China. The U.S. government is trying to pressure countries in Latin America and around the world to reduce their ties with China, and yet China is investing trillions of dollars building infrastructure around the world. Just in Peru, this Chinese state-owned company, Costco, not to be confused with the U.S. company Costco, this is COSCO. This Chinese state-owned company, along with a Peruvian company, invested more than $3 billion over years building this megaport that will fundamentally transform trade, not only for Peru, but for all of Latin America, and help them to grow their economies and to develop. So what was the U.S. response? They claimed to donate 40-year-old diesel trains that were actually not a gift. They were not a donation. They were bought by Peru for $6 million. I mean, what can you even say to something like that? It's just not serious. This shows how ridiculous the comparison is, that the U.S. expects countries around the world to sacrifice their own economies, to hurt themselves in order to benefit the U.S. and try to weaken China. And yet China is actually offering tangible trade, economic opportunities, development opportunities for formerly colonized countries that were colonized by the West. That's one of the reasons that they're so poor compared to the Western colonial nations that got rich through slavery and colonialism and war and exploitation. And yet the U.S. still shows this neo-colonial attitude, and U.S. media outlets are referring to Latin America as their backyard. The Trump administration in his first term, top officials in the Trump administration repeatedly invoked the 200-year-old colonial Monroe Doctrine, telling countries in Latin America they can't be friends with China. But the U.S. is not offering anything as an alternative. Okay, it's offering 40-year-old trains that you still have to pay for. And by the way, it's certainly not just Peru. There are more and more countries in Latin America that are also seeking help from China to develop important infrastructure projects. And this November, Nicaragua also announced another major project to build an interoceanic canal. This was unveiled at a historic business summit between China and Latin America and the Caribbean that was held in November in the Nicaraguan capital, Managua. This proposed project will help to connect the Atlantic to the Pacific from a port in the city of Bluefields on the eastern Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, and then crossing through west near the capital and also near a major international airport that China is helping Nicaragua to build. And it will connect to Port Corinto on the western coast in the Pacific. This will be a game changer, not only for Nicaragua, but for Central America, which can help massively increase trade between Central America and the Caribbean and China. And it will also be an alternative to the Panama Canal, which has historically largely been overseen by the United States. And also, there are many logistical problems with the Panama Canal. And this would be an alternative that would help significantly kickstart economic growth and development in a region of the world, Central America, that has been attacked and invaded and occupied by the United States multiple times. The U.S. military has invaded and occupied Nicaragua 3 times in its history and backed coup attempts and wars. And back in the 1980s, the CIA put mines in Nicaragua's ports. So instead of trying to help Nicaragua develop and increase its trade and grow its economy, the U.S. was blowing up its ports and carrying out these horrific acts of war to try to overthrow Nicaragua's leftist Sandinista government that came to power in a revolution after overthrowing a U.S.-backed right-wing dictator who ruled the country with an iron fist for decades, he and his family, the Somoza regime. And in 1986, the top UN legal authority, the International Court of Justice, announced that the U.S. owes reparations to the people of Nicaragua after it carried out war crimes and violated international law in carrying out these attacks on Nicaragua. So this is the so-called alternative that the U.S. is offering Latin America: intervention, coups, wars. Meanwhile, China is telling countries in the region, you can have any system you want, we're not going to interfere. We want mutually beneficial win-win cooperation. China benefits because it gets access to more trading partners and it diversifies its trade relations, so it's no longer economically dependent on the US and the West that are aiming at trying to contain and destabilize China. And then, of course, the other countries in Latin America and Asia and Africa, they benefit because they get critical infrastructure. It helps them to develop, to grow their economy. They can trade with China as well. And at the end of the day, it is the West that is left out of this process because the US-led West only wants to maintain its hegemony and its domination of the world. And the US-led West only wants their corporations, mostly US corporations, to profit. Because again, it's largely Chinese state-owned companies that are operated by the socialist government, not for profit, that are overseeing these projects. Whereas the United States and the G7, they're offering billions of dollars of investment opportunities to private companies like BlackRock, whose rich oligarch clients will benefit from buying up privatized infrastructure in the global south, which only continues this process of colonial and neo-colonial and imperial exploitation. Because once again, it was the Western powers that colonized most of the world and continue trying to exploit the formerly colonized countries that formally got their independence, but have been trying to fight for true sovereignty as the Western powers continue to interfere in their internal affairs. So this is the real reason why China's influence is growing around the world. It's not because, as the US government claims and US politicians and the Western media claim, that China is forcing countries to do this. It's because it's also in their economic interests. Other countries are benefiting and economically developing and increasing their trade with the country that has become the world's largest economy, the world's factory, that is producing 35% of global manufactured goods, and that is also investing in other countries to help industrialize and to develop. So until the US-led West actually provides tangible alternatives, not trains from the 1980s that are not even donated, you have to pay for, that's not a real alternative. China is offering a true alternative, which explains why its influence is growing around the world. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I'm the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe. Please share this, and I will see you all next time.